10 nights ago on Rosh Hashanah, my sermon asked us to look at the outside world, the world outside of this place, to contemplate the difficult and weighty issue of anti-Semitism. But tonight, on the eve of Yom Kippur, let's instead look inward at something a bit more gentle, something over which we do have much more control and can use to bring a bit more sweetness to our lives and to the lives of those around us. First, a little story about being fully present. A young man left his younger brother's room in the hospital and headed home for some desperately needed sleep. He had been at his brother's bedside for 48 hours straight. The worst was hopefully over. His brother's condition had been critical, but now, thank God, seemed to be stable. Time for some rest. He had felt helpless and frustrated the whole time he was there in the hospital because there was nothing he could do to help. All he did was sit there. He couldn't even think of anything useful to say. He just sat in the chair next to his brother, held his hand, and every once in a while would murmur, "I'm here, I'm here." Early the next morning, he returned to the hospital and found his brother sitting up and smiling with good color in his cheeks. The worst was truly over. And the younger brother looked up at him and said, thank you so much. And he said, "What did I do? I didn't do anything." And the younger brother answered, said, "You were here. You were here with me. I knew that. And it made all the difference." An ancient story from Torah of being fully present. The binding of Isaac. When God calls out to Abraham at the beginning of the saga, even before knowing what it is that God wants, the old patriarch replies, "Hineni, here I am." Hineni, a contraction of the words I and here. It's a challenge to translate because it means much more than a simple statement of I'm physically here, because it's never used casually. If a teacher's taking attendance and calls your name, Hineni would be a bit over the top. When they finally call your number at the DMV for your turn at the counter, you would not respond, Hineni. It's much weightier. It's much more profound. It's a word used only 12 times in all of Tanakh, in the entire Jewish Bible. Half of the time it's used by God, and half of the time it's used by human beings. And when God says Hineni, it's never casual. God uses the term only at very important moments. In the story of Noah, just before the great flood begins, God declares, Hineni, behold, here I am. I am about to bring a flood upon the whole earth. And following the flood, God makes the first ever covenant with human beings, declaring, Hineni, here I am, establishing my covenant with you and with your offspring to come. And when human beings use the word, it is likewise never casual. When God called upon Abraham and Abraham answered, Hineni, he was saying, with all of my being, my love, and my faith, with my full attention, I'm here for you now. And when later in the story, the boy Isaac, obediently following his father up the mountain, curious about the true intent of the journey, says, Father, Abraham replies, Hineni b'ni. Here I am, my son. That is, I'm here for you with all my heart, all my being. So in the hospital, when for those hours the older brother was fully there for his younger brother, it was a full-fledged, a loud and beautiful and profound Hineni. Let's look at one of the most beautiful ways that we as human beings can embody the essence of Hineni with the simplest of actions, making a Shiva call. As rabbis and cantors, one of the unique circumstances we encounter is that to and from funerals, we're often sitting quietly in the front seat of the limousine. And that means that we hear some very sweet and moving conversations in the seats behind us. And the subject of the conversation in the back seat is almost always the same. Who came? Who was there? Who took the time to show up for the funeral, for the Shiva? They're not talking about what people said to them or what people brought or what they wore. They're deeply moved by those who took the time to be present. This big, beautiful hineni of just being there and how much comfort it gave them. This is what you hear in a Shiva home when everybody leaves. Did you see Cousin Fred drove overnight from South Carolina? That was so wonderful. How about Jordan's college friends who drove from school upstate just to be at Grandpa's funeral with him? You know, on Sylvia's friends, the friends from grade school that she's known for over 60 years from Brooklyn, they came together in a cab. Uncle Dan was there, even though his sciatica is really bad these days. He didn't have to do that. And look at all the people who came from work. People are just simply so moved by those who show up. There's wonderful wisdom in our traditions of mourning. And during the few days following a funeral, it's so important to have guidelines, to have structure, to provide ways for others to be there for us, ways to keep occupied, to start figuring out what it is that we're feeling and where it is we need to go. I always feel it must be so sad to just come home from a funeral of a family member alone and to just go right back to work or to school the next day and give yourself no time to mourn. And we all need to mourn, and it can never be done overnight. Those first few days are so critical because we're so often feeling vulnerable and emotional, confused, we're in denial, we're angry, we're numb, we're overwhelmed, or most likely some moving combination of all of the above. Joseph Telushkin, in his book on Jewish ethics, gives us a straightforward definition of Shiva. He says, according to Jewish law, 7 days are the 7 days of intense mourning, Shiva, taken from the number 7, Sheva. They're observed by the deceased's 7 closest relatives, mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter, or spouse. The guideline is 7 days, but I know for some, 1 day is sufficient. For others, 3 is what the family needs, and for some, the entire 7. For some of our families, 7 makes perfect sense. People are coming from far away. There are waves of people who'll be coming through, or it's family tradition, or having different nights in different family members' homes. The 7 of Sheva makes perfect sense, of Shiva. For some of us, based on the makeup of our families and our needs, what makes most sense will be the 3. And in other circumstances, 1 may be what we need. And Shira, David, and I are more than happy to help you navigate that question when it may arise in your life. Whatever its length, gathering for Shiva is brilliantly a way of providing a loving embrace of our friends, our family, our community, so that we can manage those first few days, those first few tentative steps into our new reality. Shiva is very important. Shiva is very healthy. And Shiva is very wise. Well, Shira is very wise too. Sometimes, though, we get in our own way, and we prevent ourselves from helping others in their mourning or from letting others help us in ours. And the reasons are understandable. They make good sense. These are the things we often will hear from one another. I don't know anything about death. Makes me nervous. I don't know that I can go there. Or I don't know what to say. I have no idea what I would say. I'm just not going to go. Or what if I say the wrong thing? Or I've never been to one and I have no idea what to do. I don't think I want to go. Or I'm not Jewish. I don't think I should be going. Do I need to know Hebrew if I'm going to go to a house of Shiva? What am I supposed to bring with me? I don't know if I know the family well enough. Maybe I shouldn't go. But maybe tonight we can overcome some of those concerns. Do you have to be Jewish to make a Shiva call? Of course not. The power of your presence knows no specific language or religion. It's your presence. You don't have to know Hebrew or any Jewish prayers. During the short services that take place, you're participating in the most beautiful way just by being there. The biggest worry, what am I supposed to say? It can be so awkward. What's the right thing to say? What's the wrong thing to say? Don't be so hard on yourselves. There are no right words to say. Somebody has just had a death in their family, and they're going to be sad. And there's nothing you should think you can make that go away. You're greeting them and visiting them in their sadness. There are no magic words that exist, and the mourners are not expecting you to come up with any. As a matter of fact, having nothing to say is often the best move, and a very ancient tradition. Often what's best is a hug, a nod, silence. Joseph Telushin, in that same book, explains the tradition of not having to speak at a Shiva call comes from the Bible, in the story of Job and his 3 friends who come to comfort him after the death of his children. The book of Job says, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar met together to go and console and comfort Job. When they saw him from a distance, they broke into loud weeping. Each one tore at their clothes and threw dust onto their heads. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. None spoke a word to him, for they saw how great, how very great his suffering was. What mattered was that Job's friends were fully with him, not that they tried to comfort him with words. At the time he felt anguish beyond words. Their hineni was silent. Telushkin shares another more recent story of silence at a time of Shiva. Rabbi Jack Reamer was with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel when they heard of the death of Rabbi Wolf Kelman's sister. Rabbi Heschel insisted that they go to visit Rabbi Kelman and his family immediately. We went to the airport, we flew to Boston, we got in a cab, we went to the house. Heschel walked in, he hugged the mourners. He sat silently for an hour. He did not mumble a single cliche. He just sat there for an hour. And then he got up, he hugged them, and we left. Heschel knew that the most important thing of all is to know that your visit of Shiva is the most beautiful and heartfelt way of saying hineni, that words are not necessary. So if there are no words, we are people who want to do, we want to help. And during that period of time, the friends and community and co-workers of the mourner can do so much to relieve the mourner of everyday tasks and worries. That's how we help. First of all, we show up, but we can make sure that meals are taken care of. We can pick up a relative who we heard is coming in and needs a ride from the airport or the train station. We can clean up after a meal. If we're a co-worker, we can make sure the office isn't going to bother them for a few days. If we're a neighbor, we can put their trash cans out on the curb at pickup day. We can offer to print up copies of the directions to the cemetery to hand out at the funeral. We might offer to drive you around for the things you need to do as a person in mourning, preparing. We can help take care of the kids. You don't need Judaic scholarship. You don't need expertise to help in a profound way. Lisa Borowitz heads our wonderful, but I must say very small team of people who do an amazing job of leading Shiva services in people's homes when we rabbis and cantor are spread a little bit too thin. Lisa recently shared with me and Shira and David that fewer people than in the past are observing Shiva services in their homes following funerals. And that's such a shame because Shiva services are so helpful. You often hear people say, they get a little confused about the mood of this Shiva thing. Sometimes you're there and you hear a lot of laughter. You see food being passed around. You see that there's liquor, and people often say, like, is this a party? What exactly is going on? But when you gather for Shiva, first of all, some laughter can be quite lovely and very helpful. Certainly, if the laughter comes from telling a wonderful story about the deceased or you're remembering what used to make them laugh. If it's a little party-like in its feeling, wonderful balance occurs when we pause for the 10 or 20 minutes for the Shiva service. Because then it's clear what the focus of the evening is, why we're all gathered in that living room, in that home. The service embraces everyone and brings us to the same emotional locale. And it's indeed comforting for the family. And I know literally hundreds of you have had that experience in your homes. Let me end with a story from a shiva that took place in our own Kolami community in early August. Our congregant Stephen Weissglass had lost his mother, and he gave me permission to tell this story. I was invited to the home to lead a shiva service, and if I or any one of the many friends who gathered at his home were not exactly sure what shiva was all about, Stephen helped us to see its essence on that evening. When Stephen greeted me at the door, with perfect honesty, he said, I don't really think we have to do the shiva service tonight. Besides, I don't really consider myself a religious person. But tell me what you have in mind. I said, that's really up to him. I told him, if you want, I could drone on for a couple of hours. After all, I went to rabbinical school. I'm a professional. But that wasn't what he had in mind. So I told him his shiva service is usually quite brief, and that if he wanted, we could pause in the middle of the service for anyone in the family to share a story about his mother. And though he didn't necessarily feel connected to the worship part of the experience, he said, let's give it a shot. And he added that he himself probably wouldn't be sharing any stories. When everyone was gathered in the living room, we began our shiva minyan. And after a few minutes, there came the time for anyone from the family who wanted to share. There was a moment or two of quiet, with Stephen sitting on the couch, just looking around the room, filled with friends who rarely cared about him and were there for him at that important moment in his life. And then in silence, you could feel this big, beautiful hineni emanating from everyone around him. And then Stephen stood up to speak. He said, all of you know I'm not exactly a religious person. I didn't have the greatest experience as a kid in Hebrew school, pretty much the opposite. They didn't seem to want me there, and I didn't really want to be there either. And everyone in the room smiled and understood. And then as he looked around, he choked up a little bit, and his eyes filled as he looked around at the many friends and the precious family. And he said, now, this doesn't have anything to do with Judaism or religion. But I can tell you how moved I am and how much it means to me that all of you came here to be with me at this difficult time with the passing of my mother. Having you as friends and having you here means the world to me, and I can't thank you enough. And everyone in the room was silent. Everyone in the room was powerfully present and listening and hearing. And Stephen clearly felt the warm embrace of that loving circle of family and friends. Now, Stephen, I have to publicly disagree with you on one point, that it all has nothing to do with anything Jewish. Because with great respect and affection, over the many centuries, the Jewish people have wisely and lovingly molded that moment to be exactly what it was for you. I think that's exactly what Shiva is. And I thank you so much for so beautifully articulating the essence of Shiva at this evening in your home. The older brother had felt helpless and frustrated the whole time he was in the hospital because there was nothing he could do to help. All he did was sit there. He couldn't even think of anything useful to say. He just sat in the chair next to the bed, held his brother's hand, and murmured, I'm here. I'm here. Hineni. The younger brother answered, you were here. You were here with me. And that made all the difference. Israel.